Hello, everyone, and welcome to the online space of Prater Galerie. Thank you for joining this fourth and last panel discussion, which is part of the Fossil Experience project, Entanglements of Social, Environmental, and Climate Justice. Fossil Experience is a project that addresses a number of the widely divergent and in part violent realities generated by the use of fossil fuels. It included an exhibition that took place in a former water reservoir in Berlin-Prenzlauer Berg, and a series and program of performances, workshops, and panel discussions. My name is Lena Johanna Reisner, and I stand responsible for the curation of this project, together with my colleague Sonja Hornung, who accompanies Fossil Experience as a curatorial advisor. And since this is the last event in our series, I want to just very briefly take this moment to thank Sonja Hornung for all her work that she has done throughout the journey that we went through together. I also want to thank Prater team for their work and dedication, and everyone who has supported this project. And for today, I'm very happy to welcome Akínwándé, Rebecca Abena, Kennedy-Asante, Teresa Borracino from Fossil Free Culture NL, and Ayasha Guerin, who will present today and discuss entanglements of social, environmental, and climate justice. So I'm really looking forward to a panel which will look into these kind of notions from a decolonial perspective. First, I want to say a few words about housekeeping and give you an overview of what you can expect for the next 2 hours. So we will listen to 3 short presentations. We will have a short break of around 5 minutes halfway through, so after 1 hour. And then after that, we will enter into a conversation. You can pose your questions at any time through the Q&A button, which is here below. If you raise your hand, we know that we can also turn on your video and you can ask your question in person. And now I don't want to say so much more because I'm most looking forward to what the participants in our panel are going to say, and I don't want to take anything ahead, but I do want to introduce Ayasha Guerin, who will be our moderator for today's event. Ayasha is an interdisciplinary artist, a researcher and curator who lives between Berlin and Vancouver. She holds a PhD from New York University in American Studies and is currently assistant professor of Black Diaspora Studies at the University of British Columbia in the Department of English. Ayasha Guerin is invested in art practices that are also forms of activism and believes a responsibility of the research profession is to make knowledge accessible through public action and exhibitions. So Ayasha, I hand over to you to introduce our speakers one after the other, and I'm looking forward to all of your inputs and the following discussion.
Thank you, Lena. Welcome to our attendees, and thank you so much for joining us today. And again, thank you to Lena and Sonja for your work to curate this really important program that accompanied the incredible exhibition at Prater Galerie. And I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, also known as Vancouver, Canada, which is a country that has also gained its wealth and political stability from extractive fossil fuel industries on Indigenous land. The intersections of environmental justice and social justice challenges are affecting communities globally. And as we know, climate change is set not just to redistribute social advantages, but to do so in a way that compounds and locks in the distributional injustices that we've inherited from our shared histories. So our speakers today are going to speak to these histories, and they're also going to explore the socio-ecological entanglements of our present. And in our discussion, I hope that we might be able to co-conceptualize some more ethical or just futures. So the program today will run about 2 hours. And after our 3 speakers, we'll have a short 5-minute break and then return for the Q&A discussion. Lena just said this, but again, in case you're just coming in, you can type your questions into the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll attend to them at the end of the program. So now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rebecca Abena Kennedy-Asante, or Abeni. Abeni studied naturopathy, nature conservation, and ecology in Berlin and Potsdam. And in addition to Abeni's botanical interests, Abeni is also concerned with how the oppression of marginalized groups and the exploitation of ecosystems are linked. Abeni is part of Black Earth, a BIPOC environmental and climate justice collective, which is centering anti-racist, queer, and ecosystem perspectives through its existence and actions. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Abeni today. Abeni, you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, Lena, and thanks for the kind introduction, Ayasha. So yes, I will share some information and an input with you on behalf of the collective Black Earth. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Collective for Environmental and Climate Justice. And I have a little presentation. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I hope everyone can see this. Yeah, okay, cool. So I just want to start with the quote from Bayo Akomolafe, who is by chance a school colleague from Ayu. We talked about this at the exhibition opening. So Bayo Akomolafe is a Nigerian Yoruba poet and many more things. And I just want to read this out to you from the essay To Be Entangled. A flower doesn't begin at its roots and terminate abruptly at its petals. It is the ongoing interactivity of clouds, rain, sunlight, swirling dust, the keen attention of the gardener, and a cocktail of colorful critters and ecosystems of organisms. So Bayo Akomolafe is pointing out the interconnectedness of basically everything, and that we are not able to separate ourselves from ecosystems and things that are going on in the world. And I learned in one of his texts that in Yoruba language, there's not even a word for nature, which is just showing how binaries are implemented. Also now today, this whole panel is happening in English, a colonial language. So we are already limited by language. And for our collective, it is really important to understand the knowledge system, the episteme, and where the climate crisis arose, and also in where colonialism arose. So to explain a bit more about dualisms and binaries and the separation of things, I have this chart for you. So looking at dualisms in the sense of the white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative knowledge system, which was introduced by European colonizers in different parts of the world. And the main idea is that there are certain separations in a hierarchical way. So if we look at these lists of words, we can see black and white, woman and man, nature and human. And we can continue this list by saying abled and not abled, young and old, and class privileged, not class privileged. You can just continue this list. And if we read this from bottom to top, we can see, or from top to bottom, we can see on the right side, white, man, human, abled, class privileged person. So for us as a collective, it is no coincidence that in all these different scenarios of oppression and exploitation, there's the white cis heteronormative man benefiting from this exploitation. So on the other hand, black woman nature and also body shaped normal. So on the other side, we can also see who is affected, and this can help us to unite our struggles. And if we start doing activism to actually not only fight racism or colonialism or sexism, but to see it as a structural thing and to question these episteme, this dominant knowledge system that has been spread since more than 500 years and is still operating today. As we can see, if you, for example, look again at this list, who is in positions of wealth, rather people who are positioned like a white man, and who is in positions of less paid jobs than just statistically it's on the other side. So before we get into climate justice, I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to knowledge systems and who is speaking. And of course, all of us have certain privileges within these different scenarios. This has to be mentioned as well, of course. So what is this episteme is now doing for centuries? What does it mean in practice? So we have an ongoing deforestation, establishment of monocultures, plantations, centuries ongoing of natural resources, especially the exploitation of fossil fuels. And the important point is that the exploitation of natural resources is often linked to the exploitation of Black people, indigenous people, people of color, and especially gender non-conforming people, women. So again, it's not able to separate them in this scenario. And to add to Malcolm's famous and true quote, "You can't have capitalism without racism," I would add, you can't have capitalism without sexism, classism, the destruction of ecosystems, and so on. And looking at terms, so we have all agreed on, like majority of the people on this planet, that climate change and environmental destruction is mainly caused by humans. And then suddenly we are all humans again. Before we were talking about the separation of white people and Black people and how we as Black people were and are still dehumanized. But when it comes to responsibilities, then we talk about a term called the Anthropocene. Maybe most of you have heard it and used it. So it basically says it's the time age of human influences. And this is basically ignoring the responsibilities of who exactly is responsible and also profiting from these from these destructions. And so with Black Earth, we rather use the term racial capitalocene, because it rather refers to who is actually responsible for these overlapping crises. And it is it came up from François Verge, a decolonial Inca philosopher from Réunion. And just to show you some images of what does this mean, where like the responsibilities and the effects of climate change and environmental destruction. So here is a map as we know it, which is already problematic. That's why I added a Peter's projection for you here in the corner. And this tool is called Carbon Maps, and it's showing the annual carbon emissions per country, distorted per country. And it includes, the fossil fuel emissions and the emissions for cement production. So this is the first map you can see distorted. And what is obvious that countries in the so-called global north look quite huge, and the African continent shrinked a lot, South American continent shrinked a lot. And we can see that countries like China and India look quite huge too, but it's not calculated where the things are used, that are produced in China. And so many of our clothes, our electronic devices are produced in these countries. So that's the one problem with this map. And another thing that is missing is also the per capita emissions. So how many people live in a certain country. And what is missing as well is the historical emissions. So as we all know, CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but it stays in the atmosphere for several hundred years at least, depending on the combustion process. So countries that have been emitting for a much longer time, for example, Germany, I don't know how Germany is able to greenwash itself. It has the biggest lignite mine in Europe, and you can see in the historical emissions how big Germany actually is, and also the cement production and other countries as well. So this is just in terms of who is responsible. And looking at the climate change effects, this is the map that's showing areas that are especially affected by climate change consequences. And here, opposite image is presenting itself. So areas that are especially affected are in sub-Saharan Africa, and countries that are less affected are in the so-called global north. You can see the green areas. And what does this mean for people? So we have a relation between ecosystem crisis and social crisis. So floods and droughts are causing death to people, and also heat waves and other extreme weather events. And here I chose a map which is from 2000, which is more than 20 years ago, to also show that people have been dying for decades because of climate change, and to deconstruct this future narrative as if climate change is something that's happening in the future. For the global northern parts, rather, yes, but just to make sure that this is a struggle that is already happening for a while. And also the colonial continuities after the consequences. So, and wrapping it up together with colonialism. So for example, Germany had many colonies. Some people don't know, Tanzania was one of them. And German colonizers introduced coffee plantations, monocultures, and the plantations people are still drinking coffee today, maybe made by people for less wages instead of no wages. And the ecosystems are destroyed, which leads again to less resilient ecosystems. There are erosions, droughts, floods, locust crisis, which is a cascade. And then there's an unequal distribution of the resources when it comes to adaptation and disaster management. We can see the floods that were happening in East Africa in the last years, and what kind of finances were there to help building. And we saw the floods in Germany last year, and how many millions of euros were there for disaster management. And another colonial feedback loop in this ongoing crisis is the lack of representation and political decision making, and also solutions. So when we look at the COP26 last year and the outcomes and who was in decision-making positions, and how climate solutions look like, Nigeria and Germany were signing a contract last year about hydrogen, which is the green energy in Germany, but how is it produced in Nigeria? And also another colonial continuity that also stems from this system that we looked at in the beginning is the invisibility of struggles. So I don't want to leave you with all these depressing facts. I want to highlight a few resistance struggles. And again, we started more than 500 years ago when it came to the common source of environmental destructions and climate change. and also these struggles. So places were not just colonized, there were always freedom fighters, resistance movement, wars. And yeah, you can just look at these images, the Maji Maji War in today's Tanzania, then an English colony, not because Germany was woke and left the colony to the British, just there were, the other colonial powers were much stronger. So the Mau Mau War in Kenya, an armed resistance also led by Kikuyu women, the Igbo Women's War in Nigeria, Kennedy-Asante War and the women who stood up against the British in today's Ghana, the Herero and Nama resistance, and the genocide in the German colony today, Namibia. So all these were people that fought for their land, and we don't know how ecosystems and the whole society would look like without these freedom fighters, even if they might have not framed themselves as climate activists. And this is something that we can learn and deconstruct, who are climate activists and how do they look like, and do they always, what's the image of activists. And we are coming, and with Black Earth, we see ourselves in the lineage, in this ancestral line of resistance, because we couldn't fight these struggles if these people would have not fought them before us. So looking at one example, which is the topic of today's panel, and I try to keep it short and wrap it up. So the Ogoni protests in the Niger Delta in the 1980s were quite huge. So often we are asked as Black Earth, hey, why are you the only Black climate group, or why are the climate movements so white and privileged? And then it's again starting to deconstruct the question that we are asked. So I personally don't see that the climate movements are white. We had the big climate strike in 2019 in Berlin with more than 200,000 people in front of Brandenburger Tor. And there were Ogoni protests against the exploitation of fossil fuels in the 1980s with 300,000 Ogoni people. The Ogoni 9 were murdered in public in the 90s here with Kensaro River. And we were honored to speak at the Global Climate Strike in 2019, and actually mentioning Ogoni 9 and Kensaro River in our lineage. And there are some initiatives like Shell Must Fall, and I think Teresa will speak more about this in a moment. And just to see and create visibility for the struggles that are there all the time. Here another example, you saw the maps and how huge certain countries are when it comes to cement. Cement is also, and concrete, the global concrete production is causing 8 times more CO2 than the global air traffic. So these are companies that are really participating in emissions. And this is Heidelberg Cement, German company, and LafargeHolcim, a Swiss company, who have their who are producing in Nigeria in the Cross River State. And here you see images from 2016 when youth was protesting on the streets, and this was before certain white climate movements arose, and the women in the Kendeng Mountains in Indonesia are putting their feet into concrete as a symbol for protest. And these are again women of all ages, as you can see in the pictures, and people who don't necessarily choose if they want to be activists or not. They just are. And to give you just a short overview of the term environmental justice and why it's why we can reclaim this also as Black people. So environmental justice is a term that appeared in the 1980s in the so-called United States. And here you see a picture of two young children wearing signs: "We care about our future, don't harm the lives of generations to come." And they were protesting that PCB contaminated soils and trash was dumped in Black neighborhoods. And that was the first time a study of environmental racism and how the destruction or pollution of ecosystems and the wealth of Black people goes together. And yeah, there's a bit of a sad image on the other side when we look at whose voices are heard today. And here are some activists I would like to highlight. This is Ayasha, a Jamaican trans activist who is coming to all the climate conferences and being intersectional. Raquel Willis, she's saying, if your organization has no Black trans leadership, you're obsolete. And she was there in the tidy up of Hurricane Katrina. Again, just by position, you become active and aware. And also the Global Witness report is a report that's showing that people are murdered every week, every year, 200 people every year in the so-called Global South. And yeah, some names of a few people that were murdered in the same year as George Floyd: Aline Polanco, Nina Pop, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade. And I don't know how many of you heard their names, but just to create awareness of within the system who is visible. And I mean, George Floyd, a cis man, there was a video, but also of other people. There were videos when they were killed, and maybe you heard of Breonna Taylor, who's a cis woman, but the other three are trans folks that were murdered in the same year, just to show how we have different access to to visibility according to our positions. Yeah, this is a decolonial approach that I just presented to you with all these different aspects. And I'm happy about the discussion today and see how creative resistance is a tool, and how we can find new ways of thinking, of collaborating, also in the art sphere. And I want to close with a quote by Audre Lorde: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Yeah, these are the resources if anybody's interested. And yeah, our contact.
Thank you so much, Abena. That was very interesting, and I can't wait to get back to our discussion in the Q&A. Thank you also for your work with Black Earth Kollektiv and bringing these issues to the fore and doing the climate activism that you do. So next, I would like to introduce our second speaker. Akínwándé is an interdisciplinary artist, architect, curator, and writer based in Edinburgh. Working across lens-based media, installation, sound, and performance, he deals with topics related to politics and power structures, power dynamics and democratic discourse, and the relationship between the powerful and the powerless as it manifests in the multifaceted layers of more than human realities. So over to you, Ayo.
Oh, thank you very much, Ayasha. Thank you. Let me just start by showing my screen. 1 second. Yes, I hope my screen is visible now. One second. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. it's a pleasure to be here, to be part of this project. I want to say a big thank you to the host, Lena, the curators, Lena and Sonia, for the invitation, and also to Gallery Prete, Lena as well, and everyone who's been part of this amazing project. And thanks for sharing the same space with everyone here today. So this is an installation photograph from the exhibition in Berlin for field experience. The Organic Cleanup is a 2-channel video piece that I enacted in March 2020, just shortly before the first lockdown. And getting to this point, I've been engaging with the conversation around fuel in the context of Nigeria, where we have fuel scarcity, also as an oil producing country that also has a very very destructive relationship with oil across the political, economic, and also the environmental space. And one of the things that really spurred me on the journey was the area of performance in the context of how performance is consumed in the political space of theatrics, promises vis-a-vis reality. A lot of our works has been done in the Niger Delta through photography and painting. So for example, the Nigerian international artist, George Oshodi, spent almost a decade documenting the pollution and the destruction of lives and livelihood in the Niger Delta. So I was working on this paper where I was examining crude oil in the context of corruption, but then also looking at it from the point of the camera and the canvas, which has been really fleshed on by a lot of artists in Nigeria. And I also decided to consider the body as well. What role does the body play in this sort of like triptych, so to speak? Jerry Buhari is a professor of art at Ahmadu Bello University, and he's been for over 30 years, has been working extensively on environmental issues, ranging from burning of bushes after harvest seasons, the oil spillage in the Niger Delta, and he worked extensively on this the Planet series, which are like series of like large canvases around spherical shape, and he was working with oil, and then he also working with watercolor, doing a lot of miniature paintings, so like very extensive catalog of documentation and also highlighting the issues in the Niger Delta. I'm just going to play this very short video, it's just 1 minute video, that sort of like, so basically this, the scene of this video is the sort of the scene of where I enacted the performance in March 2020. And one of the things I find very powerful when you get to this spaces that it's been talked about so much in the news, oil spillage, oil spillage, oil spillage. The Niger Delta is in the south of Nigeria. I'm from Lagos. Lagos is in the southwest and the commercial capital of the country. So from in the context of being a Nigerian as well, there's also some sort of distance that exists when you're in the capital or commercial capital, so to speak. And you're sort of like, in a way, connected with the issues, but also in a way, you also kind of like disconnect. One of the things I felt rather upon being in this kind of spaces, you feel this enormous sense of hopelessness in a way, which I'm going to talk about how Ibiwari Ikiriko highlighted in his poetry. But then you're just kind of like confronted with this pretty vast landscape. You sort of like wonder, how is the whole cleaning process going to start? Where does it start? Where does it end? What does it mean to clean up an environment where the process of destruction of the environment itself is continuing. So are you going to end up cleaning up, or does this become like some sort of a performance and an effort in the fertility? So this is just like a short 1 minute video where I sort of like took video just of like the sand and the water and a lot of these spaces there. So in 2015, I started with the fuel scarcity series. So fuel scarcity in Nigeria, as against the conversation in the West regarding fuel scarcity and gas, it's a sort of like a Christmas gift. So it always happens every December. There's always fuel scarcity, fuel shortage. We don't know why. It's just from the context of the everyday people. But it happens all the time. Well, Nigeria has a very interesting relationship with crude and petroleum. So we have 4 major refineries, and I'm not sure if my estimate is right, but at the time, I think the estimate was about working combined capacity of less than 20%. So we have a situation where the crude itself is taken to European refineries, and then we end up buying the petrol, which is just one of the byproducts, at almost 400% price. So there's always this relationship between, on one hand, the very savvy entrepreneurs, so to speak, who sort of like exploit this situation for capital gains. So you have those who sell fuel in kegs, you have long queues. And what I started to do at the time was just to do this kind of like documentation, well, shooting in a way where I was sort of like shooting from the hip, so to speak. And the idea was just after 2018, I started to think more about ways in which I was going to engage with the fuel scarcity documentation. And one of the things I did in 2019, late 2018, early 2019, was to go to the fuel station with my sound recorder. I just want to record the conversations happening, because in as much as photography is very powerful in terms of like we consume images, it's also like flattening the experiences as well, the kind of like tension that you sort of like experience at the fuel stations where people spend 3 days waiting to buy probably 10 liters of fuel. In 2018, I had an exhibition which began my long-term series on Power Show. With Power Show, I was reflecting on, for the first Power Show, it was really focused on electrical power. And I had this text that was written by Bayo Akomolafe. Bayo Akomolafe is a writer, is also a clinical psychologist. On the left-hand side of the screen is just a screenshot of the text that Bayo wrote, which is titled "Irony is our most abundant resource." And on the right-hand side is a performance that I did in Lagos, where I sort of like took on the personnel of the electricity officer with the power bills, and using the power meter as some sort of like a mask and I was moving across from the city, the street, onto the gallery space with sort of like a soundscape of the generators, where I've been collecting lots of different generator sound. Sound in itself, with generator sound, also makes you sort of like look at the way we engage sound in terms of like noise and music as well, where every one generator sound becomes, the generator itself becomes like a pet, but it's not just an ordinary pet, it's a pet that you need for survival. But at the same time, it produces this kind of really, really annoying sound, but you need that sound to be able to exist. And people become very familiar with the sound of their own generator. But one of the things that Bio did was to sort of like put the sort of like situate in terms of like the fumes from the generators, the gas flare in the context of the Second World War and the dropping of the bomb by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he spoke about the fumes of irony. And I found it very, very powerful. By the way, this photograph is actually in front of the electricity company's office in Victoria Island in Lagos. It's also part of the exhibition as well. I started to also reflect on the materiality in the context of electrical power or crude oil. So on the left-hand side of the screen, it's this massive oil tank that is hovering over this empty casket. And under the casket is draped in a lot of newspaper that really speaks to the power and the environmental issues. But then it's an empty coffin. But then inside of the coffin is the voices of the people, which is kind of like buried inside, and as the oil leaks on them. And the voices is just from my compilation of complaints at the bus stop in Lagos, placed inside. So it became like a power room where the light was also flickering as well. On the right-hand side is the tank head of the generators. And I sort of like used it to create this sort of like crucifix. In the middle, you have the blue tanks represent the 14 OPEC members, where the yellow tank represents Austria, where the headquarters of OPEC is situated. So I sort of like I've played with a lot of these materials in the exhibition. Coming back into the fossil experience exhibition is Ibiwari's Ikiriko's poem. I was introduced to the poem by the curators Lena and Sonia, and really Ibiwari has 31 poems in the collection, and he assumes the role of a poet, the role of a storyteller, also situating himself as a person in the space. As it's not like writing a poetry from afar, but writing it from your own space. I find it really, really powerful. And in our extensive conversation with the curators, the idea for me to sort of like activate this poem in something like a performative way, sort of like started to take shape. And this was the performance that was staged in this space. It ran for almost 50 minutes, and the idea was just to have these oil drums, which in a way takes up the role of military formation, and also the role of the oil itself. And when you think about oil and militarism, they're sort of like intertwined. And the words that Ikiriko had penned became some sort of like activism, and also reflecting on also the history of activism in a lot of spaces where environmental pollution, oil spillage takes place. You can always find sometimes this transition between activism to the militancy as some sort of like from the pen to the sword. But then the question happens that oftentimes we've always found ourselves between those two spaces. Sometimes we move from the sword back into the pen. In the case of Nigeria, where the amnesty solution was created by the government for the militants. Well, the bigger question that of the real solution And I've always had this very very interesting relationship between activism and performance, where I sort of like believe that activism in any society where there's no political framework for change itself is some sort of performance. And what does it mean for me to go to this really vast mangrove and destroyed landscape to sort of like clean up the environment with my bare hands? What does it mean for the politicians to come to the same space as well with a news crew and take pictures and cut ribbons and set up some temporary structure and give quarterly reports of progress, which is vastly different from what you find in person. Just to my final word on that, one of the things that also struck me getting to the site in Kedere in Ogoniland, where I had a performance, was you're also confronted with pollution. From the photographic sense of pollution, we are used to images of Beijing and fogs and because we oftentimes consume photographs of other places and we sort of like base our understanding of issues from there. But this is different. You just feel it in your eyes. You just you start to squint your eyes, and also the fact that the water that I had to use for the performance as well was very expensive. It was very difficult to source. So you kind of like find this really contradictory notion, and when you think about all of these problems in the political framework of our lives itself generally is sort of like pegged to oil, whether it's context of petrodollar or context of revenues and GDP, and for me the whole entire process of meetings and talks and seminars and workshops and deliberations, taking notes and conferences, in a way, it also add to this whole larger archive of performance. And yes, thanks so much.
Thank you, Ayo. It was very cool to see so many of your projects. I'm really looking forward to discussing them with the rest of our panelists in a few minutes. So just a reminder to those attendees, if you have questions, if they come up while a speaker is presenting, you can put them in the Q&A already. So there's a box at the bottom of your screen, and if you want to submit now, you're free to. So we're going to move on to our last speaker and then take a short 5-minute break and come back together for the discussion. So our last speaker is representing Fossil Free Culture, FFC, a collective of artists, activists, and researchers working at the intersection of art and climate justice activism. It was founded by Teresa Borazino, who we have with us here today, and Daniela Paes-Leão, and they have successfully worked to eradicate fossil fuel sponsorship in the Dutch cultural sector. So FFC designs campaigns that consist of participatory performances, public interventions, films, graphics, objects, and subvertising editorial material challenging the ties between fossil fuel corporations and cultural institutions. And following their interventions, the Van Gogh Museum ended its sponsorship agreement with Shell in 2018. Applause for that. And the Concertgebouw followed in 2020, and the Nemo Science Museum followed in 2021. So today we have Teresa with us here to speak a little bit more to this really important work. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Ayasha. And yeah, I'm very honored and to be sharing the space with all of you, all these incredible artists and activists doing such an important work. Thank you also, Lina and Sonia, for the invitation. Yeah, I'm representing Kollektiv, so I'm gonna do my best to speak on behalf of the Kollektiv. I'm gonna show you what we've been doing in the past years. I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah. So Fossil Free Culture, FFC, is a small artist collective. We're based in the Netherlands. I'm now in Amsterdam. We started in 2016, targeting the relationships between cultural institutions and fossil fuel corporations, and well, basically Shell, which is the biggest oil and gas corporation in the Netherlands. And we've been doing that in several museums. When we started in 2016, there were about 13 museums and other cultural institutions accepting money from fossil fuels. And at the moment, right now, there's only 4 in the country, and smaller ones. So we've been seeing a very huge shift in the acceptation of these corporations in culture. And well, this is a picture of what is one of my favorite interventions. We did this in the Van Gogh Museum in 2019. But I'm gonna talk about why we do this work. Corporations as Shell, destructive corporations. I mean, we've heard already a lot about the massive destruction and dangers that these corporations do across the world. But these corporations need to be entangled on many levels of society to continue their operations. This is what we've called social license to operate, and they obtain that by associating themselves with politics, culture, education, media, press, several parts of society. And we are targeting the cultural sector, and what they do is art washing. They're art washing themselves, but it goes a lot beyond a PR strategy to clean up their images. I will explain that later with the images, but I'm gonna focus on the work that we've been doing to show how these relationships, how cultural institutions are enabling corporations like Shell to continue perpetuate climate racism and climate colonialism, like what we did in the Van Gogh Museum. So for you to understand, we are a collective of a small collective. We're now 4 members, but we work with a larger network of activists and artists in the Netherlands, together with Shell Must Fall and other campaigns as well. So every time we do a performance, we call out, and lots of activists join, and we get inside the institutions unannounced. But in a legal way. I mean, we buy our tickets and we get inside, but we practice what we call disobedient art, because we cross the line on what is allowed. We don't negotiate with institutions, and so in that sense, we cause a lot of disruption. And we believe that this is an important tactic to create change, which is something that we've been also seeing in our work by all these institutions that have cut their sponsorships. So when we were working in the Van Gogh Museum, there was a moment in which the museum held a temporary exhibition called In the Forest. And it was about the relationship between the artist's practice and nature, how painters as Van Gogh, but also his peers, were searching for unspoiled landscapes, and I'm quoting literally, this is the communication that they used as an inspiration for their work, and they were looking for these pristine landscapes. And they were having this exhibition, and it was a gift for us because we turned it into the the spoiled landscapes that shale is causing around the world, and with a focus on the Niger Delta, the history of so many years, so many decades of environmental destruction. So in this sense, we brought the dissonance of and the hypocrisy of a cultural institution that is, on the one hand, showing the love of nature and the importance of nature in art, and at the same time accepting money from a corporation that is destroying nature around the world. So I'm going to show you a clip of the video of what we did. This performance was called Unspoiled Landscapes. Stuck here. Yeah. And together with all the performances that we've done, we always produce leaflets copying exactly the same visual identity and layout of the leaflets, the program leaflets that the museum spreads and the museum uses their exhibitions. And we, with these leaflets, we tell the story behind the performances. And in this case, we also wanted to bring about, it's not a concept, it's a reality of climate colonialism, that in 40 years, there's been only 10 oil spills in the European Union, while in only 10 years, there's been 6,817 oil spills in the Niger Delta alone. So these corporations are not allowed to operate in the richer places of the world, but they can do that unrestrained in the places that are marginalized. And we bring this to the visibility. So we did 7 performances in the Van Gogh Museum, and until they decided to stop, the disruption was too high, they couldn't handle anymore, and they dropped shale. And then we moved towards the Concertgebouw, the main opera, I believe it's the main opera house in Europe, and one of the 3 most prestigious opera houses in the world. But this institution was very tricky because they not only, corporations like Shell not only use it as a way to clean up their image, but they also use it as a way to get in touch with the elite. It's a lot, yeah, it has a lot more reputation to have, to deal their policies and their lobby, to seal their lobby deals inside these institutions. This is an image of the galas that they hold at the Concertgebouw, where politicians, CEOs are invited, and the cultural elite. So all the deals get sealed here. So for a corporation like Shell, this is a very important entrance to political influence and lobby. And we did 4 performances, 4 interventions at the Concertgebouw, and they also decided to cut the sponsorship after that. This is one. We displayed banners. We work with a poet at the end of the concert, and the orchestra decided to play an encore so we could create this impactful image. And then after they dropped the sponsorship, we targeted the last cultural institution in Amsterdam that was accepting money from Shell, and that was NEMO, the Science Museum, which is a museum directed to children. It's a children's museum, and in this case, Shell not only gets a positive reputation and an entrance to the elites, but it also is offered a podium to spread their greenwashing. And this is a picture of festival that Shell organizes and invites NEMO to talk about innovation and how Shell is part of the solution. And while we know, still invest like 99% of their business into oil and gas extraction. So they are allowed here to present a distorted image and to brainwash children so they can keep their business for generations to come, because these children are going to be their future employees. And like this, I mean, as I said before, we're targeting culture, but Shell does exactly the same in universities, sponsoring research, sponsoring education programs, and in which they make sure that they will have employees brainwashed for their operations. But I want to center on climate justice and climate colonialism. We started working in NEMO when the pandemic started, and so the museum was closed. And 2 years ago, in 2020 it was, yeah, we commemorated the 25 years that the Ogoni 9 were murdered in Nigeria. Ogoni 9 were 9 activists that were killed by the Nigerian government, and Shell was complicit in their murder. There were the leaders of the resistance there, and together with Shell Must Fall, there was a whole mobilization in the Netherlands and also across Europe and across the world to commemorate, to do a memorial, and I remember the 9 activists that were killed. So one of the actions that we did as part of this mobilization was bringing the 9 torches of the Ogoni resistance to the museum. We held the fire of the Ogoni resistance that is still alive, even though they've killed the leaders 25 years ago. And because the movement there and the peoples there are still claiming for reparations. And so we held the fires with 9 torches and projected a poem by Ken Saro-Wiwa, one of the activists, on the facade of the building. And after that performance, we did an intervention. That was also the last intervention we did at NEMO. After this, they decided to stop the sponsorship. That was again a gift to us. There's this water mill in front of the entrance of the museum that talks about the butterfly effect, which is a phenomenon in science. How the flippering of a butterfly, a small action in one place can create massive effects on a different place in the world. And so we turned this installation into the shell effect and painted the water black and changed the 4 plaques that were explaining the butterfly effect for the history of the shell effect, and talked about the history of climate colonialism by shell. These are some images, but I wanted to share with you the text because I believe it's very powerful, because we need to remember this history, and because the past is still here, it's still in our cells, it's still the history is still present, and it also determines the choices that we're going to make for the future. So we remembered not all the places, because this list is not exhaustive, but we named a few of the names that were bulldozed and annihilated and destroyed by the machines of shell across the world. And like Quichua, Achuar, Shuar territories in Ecuador, Nanain, Orog, Nivik in Russia, and Mapuche lands in Patagonia, Argentina, and the Ogoni territory in Nigeria, and talked about the ripples of shell's actions around the world and how they are a profit, like the whole profit in the West is being gained and heavily subsidized by the destruction in what we've made as the global South. So I'm going to leave my talk here, and I just wanted to share that our first goal is close to the end. We are now working at the Groningen Museum in the north of the Netherlands, and which is sponsored by not Shell directly, but by their gas corporations and then the Dutch government. And we only have 4 museums left, and at the same time we're now envisioning how our new mission is going to look like, and because we're starting to create a program called Disobedience Futures Towards Post-Extractive Cultures, and to try to imagine how a culture could look like without fossil fuel extractivism. Thank you. Stop the screen. I lost my cursor.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was great. We love to see when art actions end in some tangible, change for climate justice and environmental protection. So really important work you're doing over there. Okay, so it's been 5 minutes, so we're going to return to our panelists and start the discussion. Feel free to type in your questions to the Q&A box as they come up, whenever they come up. I will start our conversation off just with a little bit of a reflection. At the moment, I'm actually reading this book by Olufemi Otaiwo. It's called Reconsidering Reparations. It's a great book, and in it, he makes this case that the economic and political systems that have been developed by sort of global racial empire are responsible for the accumulations that explain our current climate crisis, right? So he defines this as both the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the highly uneven buildup of advantages and disadvantages that determine how climate vulnerability is distributed within and between countries. And so what's interesting about this book for me is that he also identifies something that he calls a constructive view of reparations. So he argues that what we need is not just to kind of redistribute money, but we also need to redistribute like knowledge, right? And we need a whole world remaking project, right? It's kind of similar to Martin Luther King's comment that he feared that, you know, Black people in America were integrating into a burning house, right? And that we would all have to become firefighters, right? That it's not enough to just, you know, kind of redistribute things into the systems that we have, but we actually need to remake the systems. And so as I was listening to all of you, I was thinking about how you all are doing this in your own ways, right? Like you're urging the remaking or reconceptualization of knowledge systems, of new language and kind of renamings of colonial violence. And you're all also bringing new art or new like visualizations of inequalities to public so that we can better address them. But I also noticed that you all are also engaged in a kind of process of deconstruction as you build, right? So as you're making these new interventions and forming these new solidarities, you're also deconstructing democratic discourses, right? Deconstructing the power structures that we've inherited and doing this all to kind of expose the contradictions within them so we might undo them. And I think that you're all taking like different approaches to this process of deconstruction and rebuilding. And I actually wanted to start with a conversation, or start with a question for Ayo, actually, because I noticed that in your work, you are using a lot of irony and satire and sarcasm, right? And you also mentioned in your presentation, like that there can be a sense of hopelessness, right, when you enter these environments. And so I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more to your use of humor to kind of, you know, engage with these histories and these realities and these challenges that are something that can bring people to a sense of hopelessness. It seems your work is using humor really creatively here.
Thanks a lot, Ayasha, and thanks to Abena and Teresa. I think so in Nigeria, for example, humor is a way that we make sense of reality. So, for example, we are aware of how the relationship between governance and those who have been governed, and politics and reality, how it works. And it's the context of when you are in an environment where there's physical violence, so to speak. You can never have PTSD because you're just like, you're in it. So, and also like the system, the global system itself requires you to be there, you know, for the extraction, production, and consumption triangle to be kept intact. So irony becomes a way in which we process things. Why should we have to have our oil processing refineries in Europe? But then if we stop that process, then certain reactions are going to happen in terms of human rights violation, Nigeria being sanctioned and all that kind of stuff. So we kind of like find ourselves, so to speak, in this big play, and we just kind of like process things from that way. The irony and reality becoming neighbors. For example, Bayo spoke about how we are constantly performing hope in the whole. If you remove hope from people, you remove sometimes the basis for them to be alive. So you have to have something that you're hoping for a change, hoping for something good. And instead of hope, sometimes might not be tangible, but you just have to cling to it. And also like the irony itself of actually having to have us to empty our resources for all empty promises. So in a way, everyone gets it. And when you come in from an intellectual sense to speak about these issues that are very, very practical, you don't want to sound too philosophical about them. You just want to use the language that people are very, very familiar with. What does it mean to be in the midst of plenty, but also to lack? That in itself is an irony. but then the irony is very important for you to still remain alive. And how do you make sense of that?
Yeah. Thank you. I guess maybe I'll go to Abena now. And it seems to me that the work of the Black Earth Collective is a kind of re-education project as well, right? A kind of reconceptualizing or reclaiming Indigenous knowledge systems, right? And looking for language that better attends to the complexities and harm, right, of climate colonialism, as Teresa mentioned it a few times. And I wondered if you would like to speak a little bit more to how your collective works together and what you do with that knowledge and that language once you identify the ones that are working for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And also it was really good to see your presentation, Ayu and Teresa. And yeah, I think that's always the first step, like you mentioned, to acknowledge the systems that are still in operation and to be ready to actually let go of certain privileges, or at least to be aware about it. And I think this already is an ongoing task that takes a lot of energy. And with Black Earth, we come from different political backgrounds, and we started with quite a lot of direct action, but also being aware of how can BIPOC, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color be do actions. Maybe not everyone has the same status. Maybe Black people are rather targeted by police violence and other forms of violence, performing actions, putting our bodies out there. So when we do actions, this is always to be considered. And so, for example, we started to with forest occupations and learned how to actually climb and do this kind of things, but again, with this kind of awareness. And it's not always hanging from a tree with a banner saying, for example, climate justice matters for Black Lives Now, which was one of our first banners, but also sharing skills to show other people how to do actions in a way that's appropriate to our needs. And then also tree planting actions. You mentioned this before. Is this a good, oh no, that was in one of the questions. Is this a good solutions, and how and when? And we performed tree planting actions for BIPOC. And then it's again the question, we are based in Berlin, and if you leave Berlin, you're in the countryside, and it's very racist, and you cannot just bike there and with Black kids and stuff, because there's sometimes areas where we did the tree planting action where there's just organized Nazis around, and we had to first create a telephone chain. And then again, the questions, do we go with public transport, or do we take do we hire a bus to be safe, which is run by fossil fuels? So when we do things, it's not so easy as if you were positioned in different ways. And creating visibility, like I said, one of the later banner drops is about naming murdered environmental activists. And I presented this list earlier. It's 200 every year, and how many of us know how many names? So really sharing this kind of platform, and also doing Zuli events, solidarity events. I saw in, I think your presentation, Teresa, that you also mentioned, Shell in Waimapu and with the Mapuche people. So I just want to highlight also a few groups that we have collaborated with, which is Mabuna Mapuche group, which is based in Berlin. So we just did, for example, a film screening about Wangari Maathai from Kenya, and having food, vegan, plant-based food, trying to avoid trash, and trying to live somehow the examples. When we meet, we try to have plant-based, plastic-free package and food, and see that we know that not everyone has access to this, but to try to create options for this. And bringing Black bodies to nature itself is already something. So majority of our events are especially for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And we've been to places that are usually not so accessible. I mentioned the tree planting action earlier, but maybe some of you know, I think Lena and Sonja were collaborating with the Floating University in Berlin, which is a very lush, beautiful green, watery space where we did one of our screenings and just claiming spaces where you usually wouldn't expect a bunch of Black people. And yeah, I think that's already like a bit of an overview, and there are so many other things, and maybe we wouldn't necessarily frame, you mentioned education in the beginning, maybe this is not even our main goal, to educate especially white folks, but we do get a lot of requests from universities and more academic contexts. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think that work of connecting the struggles, the historical and the present struggles of colonized peoples around the world is really important, especially to sort of combat that hopelessness and that, I like to call it oppression depression, that people are feeling everywhere globally. Yeah, and so I wonder, maybe Teresa, if you want to talk a little bit to the experience of working in a collective to develop these art actions, and what that process looks like when you're designing an intervention, and what kind of conversations you have together to decide what you will do and what your goals are. And also, if you'd like to share a little bit about what your relationship has been with the institution as this happened. It looked from the videos that you were kind of left alone for the most part by the security and things like that. And speaking to Abeni's point about thinking about or being sort of attentive to the different sort of risks of taking up space in public in different bodies, and what kind of conversations you all are having behind the scenes before the action.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's two questions. I will start by the last one. About the relationship with institutions. Yeah, well, I just showed you a few of the work that we've done, and but we've done other performances in which the security were really not happy that we were there. And so, as I said, I mean, we don't announce this, is unsolicited, and yeah, we try to cause disruption. That's the way we believe it is the most effective to create change. So, but that implies a lot of risks indeed. So we've had confrontation with security with the Van Gogh. Every institution has been different. Every context is different. The Van Gogh Museum actually never had a good strategy how to deal with us. Every time that we went in, they had a different strategy. Sometimes in the umbrellas performance, in the forest performance, they decided to let us do our thing. But before and after, they've been very violent and aggressive towards us. We've been also confronted with police, and me being Latina, a woman of color, have been also targeted and having to do with more police repercussions because of my skin color. So yeah, we also experience racism in our work and in the Concertgebouw, we had to do also not only with the security, but also with the public, because it's, not only, but very much populated by the cultural elite, people that can pay 50 euros a ticket to enjoy an evening of a concert. And we try to disrupt the concerts, not to disrupt the concert because I mean, that's art and that's untouchable, but many of the performances, the orchestra decided to play an encore. So we're already starting the interventional performance, and then there was a gift at the end. And so there was more disruption than we expected, and the public was really pissed off. So we've received also hate emails from random public people. Yeah, but well, I mean, we don't care that much because we know that it's people with a lot of entitlement, and so that they didn't prevent us to keep us going. And we've also been confronted with the security a lot. And so yeah, it's a risk that we consciously decide to take, and we also have a team of care and support. After every action, we try to do some harm reduction or do some work to process what we've experienced, and so we can continue and don't burn ourselves out. And so yeah, that was one part of their question. The other part was about the people that we work with, and yeah, so it's been a ride. Our work is a piece of a larger ecosystem of movements, and we're very much aware. We've been doing very specific work so far, targeting something very, very specific, believing that if different groups do the same work, then all the pillars that are upholding the system will fall down eventually, hopefully. So so if more and more groups are doing their part, then we can create we can undo the system. We can, and so and we've been seeing the change happening, especially in public perception, because it's not socially accepted anymore to have relationships, for cultural institutions to have association with these corporations. And also universities are being challenged, and in other places. There's now a very large campaign on European level targeting fossil fuel advertisement, which I hope is going to be effective, because that would mean that a massive outlet for their brainwashing and greenwashing and all the washing machines that they need to continue will be taken away. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. So we have a question in the chat. I will read it aloud, and then Ayo, you can begin with your answer, and the other speakers, you can feel free to jump in. And then I also would like to open it up to each of you to see if you have questions for one another, and maybe that can be how we close out this talk today. So this question that we have from an attendee, SH, I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself or read the question yourself, if you are here. Otherwise, I can do it. If you raise your hand, I'll let you, but okay, I'll read it. So the question is, these days, it seems that big oil companies and other companies led by BlackRock are moving away from philanthropic models, sponsorship of cultural institutions, to so-called ESG, environmental social governance criteria, to justify or offset the risk created by carbon-heavy activities, including the risk of community resistance, with measures that may or may not make a difference, Planting trees could lead to continued monoculture. Investment into hydrogen may or may not be a valuable contribution to the energy transition. Fostering diversity and gender equality within their companies, encouraging community participation, or hosting a kindergarten in an otherwise toxic real estate development may lead to nice photos for Instagram with no substance behind them at all. So this is a very diffuse, subtle, and slippery way of continuing with business as usual, carbon-heavy profit while using empty gestures of goodwill to look nice. Plus, ESG gives companies access to new, mostly debt-driven green financial products to create more profit, such as green bonds. At the moment, there is no standardized independent way to really verify a company's compliance to its ESG promises. But in the context of pandemic and climate crises, ESG is now dominating the world of finance. Is this something you're aware of or thinking about? Because it really worries me, not only in my role as a cultural producer, especially when you see how quickly politicians and people can get sucked in by this and believe the greenwash. So Ayo, do you want to begin with an answer to this question?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very loaded one. I remember Sonia and I were in Berlin. We noticed a tree that was being protected. But that tree that was being protected was protected by 3 other pieces of wood, they were ex-trees, so to speak. So you have the city design all of these things, very important to plant trees. But to plant those trees and to preserve one tree, you had 3 trees had to be killed to make that happen. And when you look at that, and also taking it back with the idea of irony in the Nigerian context, irony helps you to manage shock levels. It also helps you to manage expectation and promises. Campaign is poetry. Governance is prose, and that's why politicians say a lot of things, or leaders say a lot of things, and they do the other one. And with that irony as well, you then also sort of understand, or try to understand, make sense of the broader capitalistic structure that we find ourselves in. Whether you're a Marxist or whether you're this or you're that, you're constantly participating. Whether you have 20 or 50 trees or plants in your room, and makes you feel closest to the Amazon. It doesn't, you can't live in the Amazon physically, 4 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so irony itself makes us kind of like grounded. And I'm speaking from the point of Nigerian, where you sort of like understand this. It makes you kind of like just be grounded and also deal with stuff. But then I also am fascinated with language as well. So when the language changes to something like ESG, it sounds very cool, sounds very non-threatening, sounds very climate compliant. And if you operate in the broader box of capitalism and you start seeing words like ESG flowing around, you just need to just update your social corporate social responsibility and just allocate a certain fraction for ESG, and then you're fine. Because the reality itself is being obstructed. What we see and what really exists are 2 different things. And because we are all engaged in this machine that needs to keep moving, because if it starts to move, then what happens? What happens if the internet goes off for 1 minute? And but then we cannot imagine that reality. But then we can have that machine going on while we complain about the effect that the machine is causing. So this in finance, those who are economic environmentalists, I've seen people who are PhD and stuff like that, they also find themselves in that machine. So it's a massive ironical space that we find ourselves in. And for me and for many people in Nigeria to be grounded, we just use the idea of the tree, the 3 trees protecting 1 tree. So we become the users, we become those who are protecting the identity or the fact that people there's more importance as to what you assume to be doing than what you're really doing. I don't know if I've gone in tangent, but it's a very loaded question, which is very powerful, and I will spend more time to just reflect.
Thank you. Abena or Teresa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Ayo already said a lot, and I just have a small thing to add maybe, because again, quoting Audre Lorde, we cannot, with the same tools, the master's tools, will not dismantle the master's house. So if we continue this capitalist logic when it comes to the solutions or these ESGs, it won't work in the end. And you mentioned the tree planting as an example, and even conservation on whose shoulders and who is actually doing the decisions. And now there's also the plan to have 30% of the global terrestrial and marine ecosystems protected, which sounds like a good idea also for carbon storage and biodiversity conservation. But again, who made this decision and who is not involved? And there's a lot of interesting literature also by Mordecai Ogada, who framed this word of colonial nature conservation and colonial solutions in this kind of sense, where white European scientists go to the African continent and decide what is good for the climate, what is good for the ecosystems, and then indigenous people, Black people, don't have access to their land, and we can see clearly that indigenous managed forests have highest biodiversity and carbon stocks. And yeah, I don't want to romanticize only this, there's many different knowledge systems, but just from the approach of, again, who is in the decision making and with what kind of logic behind.
Thank you.
I don't have much to add to this. I mean, there's a lot of things have been said already. I totally agree with what's been shared, and I also think all these systems are so dangerous, and so they also play a very psychological level towards the individual, because this is part also of all the whole offsetting systems that, I mean, if you fly, you're offered a way to offset the emissions by planting trees that are destroying indigenous forests, for example, and creating more monoculture. So we are sold a way to, yeah, to clean our souls and to not feel guilty, and to be able to continue our business as usual as members of society. So I think it is super, super dangerous, and we have to be very wary about all these methods to continue offsetting and continuing the way the consumerism way we live.
Right, yeah. And because, you know, the problem is just pushed around the globe, right? This pollution just ends up wherever there are the least environmental regulations, which are also those places which have been indebted, right, to the World Bank and to all sorts of kind of shadow political governance, right, that is yeah, you know, shaping our relations through systems of debt, right? And so yeah, it's really not enough to be ethical in a you know, a first world nation and be, you know, sending all the dirty work and all of the pollution elsewhere where the regulations aren't as high. So we have to really think about this globally, right, and beyond the borders of nations, and to rethink our relations to one another and our solidarities to one another, which is the work that you all are doing. So thank you. Do you all have questions for one another? Yeah, Abena?
Yeah, I have a question for Ayo. So at the exhibition opening, we were standing next to the small bonfire and had a little conversation. And I remember we were talking about non-colonial languages, and I remember you saying, because I was talking about this dualistic system, and I remember you were saying, Ayo, well, in Yoruba, we don't have pronouns anywhere, everyone is they, and it's very similar in Twi, but unfortunately, I'm not able to speak it. So my question for you is, how does being able to speak a non-colonial language, in this case, Yoruba, influences your art and your performances and your activism? And yeah, also maybe, or probably you know, Oyeronke Oyewumi. I recently discovered a really beautiful text of hers where she is deconstructing gender and binaries in Yoruba culture, and she's been publishing books since the 90s about this, and I'm just like, wow, there must be different, or maybe there's different understandings of approaches when you're able to have a different language also. Yeah, that's my question for you.
Thanks, Laura, Abena. So I've stayed in sort of like in the forest in the southwest of Nigeria. I've lived with herbalists, and just try to understand the culture. And one of the things I find very fascinating is how this is me speaking with trying to avoid big words like colonialism and blah blah blah. It's how there's a disconnect between with the powerful thing about the colonial process was separating the spirituality from the culture. So there's a spiritual element of the culture, and there's a language itself. And when you think about how it should be in the real sense, the relationship with Earth is a very respectful one. And if you have a spiritual relationship with Earth, where, for example, the forest was sort of like a museum, so to speak, where you have the shrines and you have all of those elements kept in the forest. If you have a spiritual relationship with something, you cannot abuse it. But if you have a capitalistic relationship with something, then you're sort of like thinking in terms of cost and benefit and what's the right economic word? So you think about cost and benefit and trade-offs. Basically, you think in terms of trade-offs. And if it makes more sense profitably to cut the forest, then you cut it. And if you need to create a fake forest that's going to be cut in the future, then you do that. So I see that from one point. The other is a conversation around gender itself, where we have a society, and I speak for Yoruba, and also maybe this also extends to a lot of African cultures as well, where we have the society structured around age and not gender. So it doesn't matter if I have an elder one and the older one who is a woman or not. You know, she tells me to sit down, I sit down. So the society is understood from the point of age. And then you see how language comes in, as also Oyewumi put in a book, where the British, for example, started to play with the language. So instead of using words like traders in the market, because the market space was controlled by women, it's a territory. Same thing with the household. So you use, instead of using things like traders, you use things like market women. And so you sort of like gender them, make them market women. And you, by having market women, you don't need to have market men. They become the traders, and those women become the market women, because life in the British context was understood from the point of gender. And so I find it very fascinating when people speak in terms of progress. We're moving into this non-gender future, and I'm like, this is probably the past in some context. And I also find that a lot of times when a lot of this conversation about a futuristic approach to thinking sort of like seems like a very old or ancient way of thinking in certain places as well. So that also puts the idea of the future and the past in this very context of, in terms of progress. Are we really making progress? Or are we really just trying to find a way back somewhere else? Well, we cannot admit that, but we have to create a very futuristic language to show that we are actually an advanced civilization, rather than people just live in concrete jungles, so to speak. I don't know if I answered properly.
Thank you. Now more questions come up, but it's almost 8, so another time.
All right, do we have any last questions, or shall we wrap up today's program? No? Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing your work and doing this important activism and making these new visuals and new language and connecting and caring. So I'm very inspired by all the work you're doing, and I just want to thank Lena for bringing us all together. And I want to thank our attendees for coming and being here with us, sharing this space for the last 2 hours. Lena, do you want to say anything to close out the program today? I think this is the last discussion, so
yes.
Being together, such a
thank
amazing...
you, Ayasha, for passing it on to me. Thank you for your warm and attentive moderation, facilitation of the event. Thank you also from my side to everyone who attended, and thank you to the speakers for both your work as well as your presentations. And I would like to wrap this up by mentioning just a few of my takeaways. And one of it is that what we need is not only to redistribute money, but also to redistribute knowledge. And then it's not enough to redistribute things in the system that exists, but we also need to change how the system operates. And this means deconstructing the power structures that we have inherited, which is what you're all doing in one or the other way in your practice, as Ayasha rightly pointed out. And so speaking of system change, which is what many activist movements coming from different directions are calling for, I wrote down this quote, which Abena twisted slightly, which is that we can't have capitalism without racism, classism, environmental degradation, etc. And in that sense, thank you for the kind reminder, Abena, of the implications and problems of the term Anthropocene, which is a term that we decided not to use at any point in this exhibition and program, because it hides asymmetries as well as colonial and racist continuities in the distribution of wealth and privilege on the one hand, and the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on the other. And so, yeah, thank you also for the insight into both of your practices, Ayo and Teresa, which I really enjoyed. And Ayo, also thank you for sharing images of the exhibition. It was so beautiful to see you talking about it. And thank you also for then anchoring again this conversation. And also for all the beautiful conversations that we had as part of this program, also before. And listening to you, I found it, just again, like so important to see this connection between how big oil operates in places like the Niger Delta, which has I just counted again, 68 years history of oil production, of extreme violence and human rights violations. And the problems are all still ongoing. It's still happening. There's still oil spills that sometimes take weeks to be addressed by corporations and people who should be responsible and act more responsibly. I'm not going to get deeper into it because, just to see that on the one hand, and then how big oil on the other hand operates in white cultural elite spaces in European capitals, like the one that Teresa pointed out to us. And I believe that making these realities, these very different realities, visible and exposing them, like making them public, is very important. And also a moment where art and culture, and especially visual art, can step in, as one of its major concerns by definition has always been that of making visible and making public. And so thank you for the reminder, Ayo, also that not only investigative work and intellectual rigor and disobedient activist strategies like the ones of Fossil Free Culture NL enacting are important here, but also humor, hope, and irony. And on that note, with hope, or, you know, some sort of empowerment in terms of everything that wonderful people like you are doing already to address these issues. Like, on that note, I want to leave you into the evening. Thank you again all for your generous input and questions. Thank you also to Linus Kaufold for the technical support of this event and the event of last week. We will upload a recording of this event and also what happened last week. We will upload it in the coming weeks, and we'll share a link also through the newsletter of Prater Galerie. And yes, I think that's it. Everything, I hope, is said. If not, please help me. Nobody says anything in the chat. Thank you again to Prater Galerie for this journey. And yes, goodbye. Enjoy the evening.